or spiritual leaders, the appeal of scientists, obviously under the influence of the environmental crisis. Normally we consider scientists, because of their professional orientation, as secular humanists, interested in the whole question about evolution, without any notion about real purpose of life or the ultimate concern. But these scientists appeal to the religionists and spiritual leaders to help them to share this vision of the earth as a sacred domain, partly because they are deep concerned of the environmental crisis. The environmental and ecological question, in a way, compare all religious traditions to re-examine their presuppositions in regard to the earth. But this new challenge is not only a challenge to scientists, to humanists, but a major challenge to all the so-called axial age civilizations, the major religious traditions in the world. It is not enough, from my point of view, that one's spiritual tradition make limited adjustments to accommodate the ecological dimensions. For example, now the Buddhists, the Christians, the Muslims, certainly the Confucians and Taoists, are all trying to retrieve what they call some of the ideas in the traditions that could be considered as friendly to the earth, as important for understanding the earth as a sacred domain. All kinds of adjustments have been made. For example, in the Christian tradition, the idea of man is created and have dominion over everything that has been created. And that sense of dominion is not control or domination, but a sense of stewardship, even a sense of partnership. The Buddhists, for years, considered the earth as the samsara, as the red dust. And the true salvation is to go beyond, not only yourself, but go beyond the earth, and with a very strong sense of annihilation of the passions and the ideas. Eventually, as a renouncer, you move beyond transmigration. The earth, the life, the earth, this life, because the idea of transmigration in so many lives, is not as essential, as important. However, one of the most powerful movements in Buddhism in recent years is what we call humanistic Buddhism, or concerned, engaged Buddhists who really want to be involved in transforming the society from within. They become activists, and they also become major supporters of the environmental movement. So the need is for none other than the secularization, to make it sacred, the secularization of nature. We consider nature as sacred. It's not something that's secular, that can be controlled, used for our human consumption. This actually requires a fundamental restructuring of the basic theological thinking in Christianity or philosophical thinking in Buddhism and many other traditions. By taking the sanctity of the earth as a given, we try to begin to think about those kind of issues without relegating earth to the background as something simply secular. We consider the earth as sacred. Heaven is sacred. God is sacred. But earth is also sacred. Implicit in the scientists' appeal is the necessity of a new kind of thinking, religious thinking or theological thinking, involving nature in the basically considered as a kind of dichotomy between human and God in the Christian sense. The relationship between human and God will have to be enriched now by the presence of nature, by the presence of earth as an integral part of this process. This has generated a lot of very interesting discussion in theology. But the question of the sanctity of the earth, as I pointed out, should be considered as the major reference for our discussion of economy, of politics, of society, of culture. As I noted last time, globalization should be understood in the context of the environment. You can even say the world economy is a subsidiary of the environment. If the environment is bankrupt, depleted, dissipated, eventually marginalized, then not only our economy, but everything else is going down the drain. So this notion, I think it is a very weighty notion, but it's difficult to fully explore it. The sanctity of the earth as given. On the surface, the Confucian tradition recognizes that very early on. Not only the sanctity of the earth, but the sacredness of the body. But yet, I will argue the Confucian tradition has to be fundamentally retransformed, fundamentally reformulated, before it can become a very positive intellectual force for us to understand this dimension. Related to the idea of the sanctity of the earth is the new vision that the human community will have to be considered as a reference for all our discussion. The need for a global perspective, not just a national perspective, certainly not just a local perspective. I'm critically aware of the fact that all politics, as one of the politicians in Massachusetts once made Dick O'Neill, all politics is local. And in fact, in our society, national interests have always been evoked as the highest principle for formulating foreign policies. And national sentiments are very pervasive all over the world. And yet, with the emergence of ecological consciousness, which I must say is so pervasive, no matter where you go now, if you talk to high school students, they're all critically aware of this. So every human being now, with some fair education, will recognize that the global perspective is a necessary perspective, even though we may function locally, nationally, but the global perspective is a reference. This is a new phenomenon that never happened before. Speaking directly to a passage that we are very familiar with, the so-called 8 steps in the Great Learning. You cultivate yourself, so then you regulate your family, then you govern your state and bringing peace to the world. The Great Learning, the 8 steps, from the person to the society to the state to a nation and eventually to a global community. Patrick Berry, one of the leading Confucian scholars, made the following observation. Chinese and Confucian culture traditionally was about settled communities, living on the land, nourishing themselves and the land. It is this natural, organic process that Confucian self-cultivation, even the idea of cultivation is like the agricultural idea of planting and raising crops. That Confucian self-cultivation draws upon for all its analogies and metaphors. Then he notes that the farmer poet, which is a very famous farmer poet in America, Wendell Berry, makes the Confucian point. This is Patrick Berry's observation of Wendy Berry's observation. Home and family are central, and we cannot hope to do anything about the environment that does not first establish the home, not just the self and family, as the home base for our efforts. So Patrick Berry then concludes, if we have to live in a much larger world because ecological problems can only be managed on a global scale, the infrastructure between home locality and state, national or international, is also vital. But without home, we have nothing for the infrastructure, much less the superstructure to rest on. This is the message of Wendell Berry and also the lesson of Confucian and Chinese history. Now, underlying this particular perspective, the human flourishing, human self-development, human self-realization, from self-cultivation to universal peace, is a worldview that entails an overall vision of the proper niche of the human in the cosmos. This is not just a view that the importance of home and family and settled community. It is a view about where human beings ought to locate themselves in the cosmic order. The idea of home, in this sense, is extended beyond the local community. The human, so conceived, is an active participant in the cosmic process with the responsibility of care for the environment. The global global perspective then is located, it's not an abstract idea, it's located in the common human experience of relationship with the question of the self, the family, and society. But this global perspective is absolutely necessary for understanding the ecological question. So with the ecological concern, not only we now recognize the earth, like Figure Red has pointed out, as secular as sacred. The earth is a sacred domain. But any concern for the community will have to take a global perspective, even though from the Confucian point of view, we have to be rooted in our own locality, in our own environment, in our own society. This notion of the community as a global community, like the idea of the earth, will have to be a reference in our consideration of the ethical question. The ethical question cannot be simply identified as a local question. It has to be linked to the global community. But linking to the global community is not an abstract idea. It is a concrete idea embedded in our experience in the life world. Therefore, the Confucian notion of expanding from the self to the community and beyond. And yet we know that since the community as home must be extended to the global village and beyond, the self in fruitful interaction with community must transcend not only egoism and parochialism, but also nationalism and anthropocentrism. Now this common Confucian theme that is being repeated again and again, in the light of the ecological concern, is to see the link between the microcosm and the macrocosm. What is the self as a person dealing with everyday affairs is not at all unrelated to the macrocosm of the cosmos. And this link between the person and the cosmos, mediated through various kinds of structures, now including nature, become a central concern. It involves a process of continuous self-transcendence, but the self-transcendence, paradoxically, will not lose sight of one's solid ground in earth, body, family, and community. Through self-cultivation, the human heart and mind expands in this famous concentric circles, but that expansion is not at all a departure from the rootedness of ourselves in the family, in the community, and of course, on earth. And this interplay seems to suggest that in shifting, we say, in shifting the center of our concern, our sympathetic or empathetic concern, from ourselves to our family, we transcend selfishness. But at the same time, self-centeredness, not in terms of selfish sense, but as rooted in our idea of the body, is not at all in conflict with the fruitful interaction with family. Now, we've always talked about horizontal expansion. But don't forget, the horizontal expansion will have to be rooted in specific structures. So the environmental issue in this sense is not simply a global perspective, but also the practice that we can do on our daily basis. Our appreciation of ourselves is not at all in conflict with this relationship to family. We can say from the family to community, we go beyond nepotism. But at the same time, family as a nurturing and nourishing environment will have to be respected and underscored. It's not departure from the family, but it's rooted in the family and yet transcending nepotism. The move from community to nation overcomes parochialism, and the move to all humanity counters chauvinistic nationalism. But chauvinistic nationalism should be contrasted with patriotism. And the sense of moving beyond parochialism should be contrasted idea of learning to be fully human, guided by the ecological vision, is a movement towards a global perspective. And that global perspective is not an abstract idea. It has to be rooted in all the structures we're talking about. This is something, the Confucian orientation is very different from many other spiritual orientations. It's not transcending the particular in order to embrace the universal. It is to embrace the universal through concrete experiences of the ordinary, of the so-called limited structures. And it is in this sense the third element, the new challenge, is particularly significant. Despite globalization, we do not have homogenization. The world is not being totally integrated into a coherent social system. In fact, we have more diversity, with more difference, more conflict, more tension. And therefore, we have to recognize we are in a pluralistic world. Because we're in a pluralistic world, we celebrate diversity. We celebrate diversity, but we search for unity in diversity. We try to underscore the experience that are shareable and common without losing sight of the fact that diversity itself is to be celebrated. And the interplay between localization and globalization, and the recognition that many, many faiths, they are all valid and significant in the world. We cannot afford, even though it is a powerful movement, we cannot afford to be exclusivistic. We cannot even accept, from this point of view, of course, it's a value judgment, to say that I know what is the way, life, and truth, and all other paths are not significant. Now, the difference between faith community as a way of underscoring some of the common orientation, and yet the faith community in the sense that we normally interact with people sharing the same idea and orientation. The Christians living with Christians, the Buddhists living with Buddhists, the Confucians living with Confucians. And now the Christian will have to recognize they are Muslims, Buddhists, secularists, and so forth. They are also responsible citizens, valuable colleagues, friends, and people interacting with us on a daily basis. This sense of pluralism forces us to celebrate diversity, but at the same time, it's not simply celebrating it as a strategy, but to know that the world is pluralistic, despite the fact there's a difference between globalization and modernization. Despite all this diversity, the possibility of shareable experiences is always there. And the global perspective and the notion of the earth as a reference can all be considered as part of the shareable experience. And yet we have to celebrate diversity, we have to accept pluralism. Even inclusivism, Confucianism could be considered as a very powerful, inclusive humanism, is flawed. Flawed in the following sense. That is, if Confucianism argues that if we follow the Confucian project of self-cultivation, regulation of the family, and so forth, then human flourishing will be assured. If everybody becomes a Confucian, then there's universal peace. This, of course, the Christians and the Muslims, they all have this aspiration. If the Confucians strongly believe that's the case, and then judge others in terms of this very comprehensive humanistic vision, and consider people who fail to share this vision as not necessarily rational, not necessarily sympathetic, empathetic to the great issues of environment and of human community from a global perspective. And that becomes certain kind of tyranny, certain kind of, the inclusive mode of understanding can become implicitly a judgment, which could turn out to be exclusivist. So the Confucians ought to be extremely serious and concerned about this danger. So the recognition of various faiths is to believe, this is a difficult task, to believe that those people who do not subscribe to my point of view are not only challenging my position, they are potentially not only conversation partners, but they are potentially able to enrich my understanding of my position. in a critical light. No matter how great my idea is, if it is not being challenged, it is not put into practice in terms of the country situation, it's not going to be universalized. So that sense of pluralism is to say every civilization will have to be a learning civilization as well as a teaching civilization. And in that sense, the possibility of dialogue. So pluralism is to accept, no matter how great our ideas are, no matter how great our religion is, there's always room for improvement. There's always the possibility of being challenged by alternative intelligence. Another aspect, which is a new challenge, is the sense that sustainable development, sustainable growth, is a much more powerful sense of communal participation and human flourishing than total commitment to economic development as a political ideology. Sustainable development or sustainable growth means that unless the growth is based upon the possibility of renewal of the natural resources that we're going to spend, it will not become, it will be a short-term perspective. It's not a long-term perspective. One scholar, Yang Shu-ming, has made a very interesting observation concerning this. But before we move on to Yang Shu-ming, I want to share one observation by Arnold Toynbee, who's a great comparative historian. According to him, this was made in the 50s, long before the ecological issue became important. The 20th century's intoxication with technology has led to the poisoning of our environment and has created the possibility that humanity may destroy itself. He believes that any solution to the current crisis depends on self-control. Mastery of the self, however, cannot be achieved through either extreme self-indulgence or extreme asceticism, the elimination of all desires. The people of the 21st century must learn to walk the middle path, the way of moderation. And whether we'll be able to do that or not, sometimes it will depend upon the external situation. We may be forced to accept it. So Liang Shu-ming is a very important around, if you think of 1893 to 1988. As early as 1923, he made the observation arguing that there are three life orientations in the world. There's the Indian, the Chinese, and the Western. A very simple-minded way of looking at it. But in 1923, when China was overwhelmed by the importance of Western modes of doing things, overwhelmed by science and technology and democracy, and overwhelmed by the Western model of development, and some of the most brilliant minds turned their back against the Confucian tradition and embraced the Western idea of wealth and power. And he talked about the three different orientations. The Western orientation is development in the most aggressive sense. Development by mobilizing resources in the societal sense, but also nature in order to develop. Of course, the image is the Faustian one. You know the story of Faust. The Faust is willing to trade his soul for all these new experiences. And there's a restless march towards the expansion of the self, of the community, and very aggressive towards nature. And this, or the Prometheus unbound, who managed to steal the fire for the human and who would like to conquer the world with tremendous aggressive power. Sharply contrasted with the Western model is India. The Indian model, the highest achievement is the renouncer. The person eventually gives up everything. The true spirit of the self, the Atman, the true spirit of the self, may be merged with the cosmic order if we can overcome all the desires. Through yogic practice, through personal mental exercise, we will be able to give up. To give it up is to say, we can say it's diametrically opposed to the idea of development. It's the idea of the sanctity of the person as self-sufficient. So it's against development. And and to search for the inner truth, inner soul. The Chinese model is harmonization or accommodation. Try to harmonize with nature, try to accommodate. We know that the Confucian tradition gives us a very good idea about how this is trying to work out. And he said, at this juncture, he's talking about the Chinese, at this juncture, the Chinese have no choice but to learn from the West. Reject the Indian model because otherwise China will not be able to survive. So China will have to learn from the Western idea of the Faustian drive to conquer, to forge ahead. This is 1923, a long time ago. And yet, the West, his argument is that the West reached a certain higher level of development, economic development in particular, but also social development in science and technology, will be particularly receptive to the Indian model. In other words, don't just consider the Indian model as a model of no progress or backwards, and the Western model is a model of progress or development, and China will have to learn from the West. In the long run, his argument is that the Indian model is an important corrective. In a curious way, that's what Point is trying to suggest. If we continue to develop at this particular level of dynamism, then eventually, not because we don't want to develop, not because we don't work very hard, but the external conditions force us to think otherwise. How many people now already in the West already become vegetarians? By choice, for health reasons, for many other reasons. And why the idea of elegant simplicity is considered very attractive. Why the idea of the small is beautiful. All these notions, ideas are very much linked, not just to India, of course, to the Buddhist idea of no self and the illusory nature of our quest for goods, for strength, for wealth, for power. Now for the Confucian, this is precisely our issue here. When Confucianism became revived in India after the Second World War, it's been considered as a very important contributor to East Asian economic development because of work ethic, because of a particular kind of network capitalism, horizontal communication. All kinds of strengths of East Asia as an economic system are attributable to the Confucian mindset. To me, we have to criticize that position, to formulate a powerful critique of Confucianism as a political ideology for development. It is a highly politicized Confucianism. It is not the Confucianism we'll be talking about in the classical period or in the Middle. Now, Confucianism can also be used or abused as symbolic resources for the development of an unhealthy kind of nationalism and culturalism. The nationalistic sentiments, for example, in China now are being mobilized through certain kind of appeal to the Confucian notion of the importance of community, the importance of nation, the importance of the dignity of the person, and so forth. And this is also the argument that Confucianism, so much a part of Chinese culture or East Asian culture, it cannot be universalized, cannot move beyond the East Asian domain. You have to be raised in a kind of East Asian environment to fully appreciate the complexity of the tradition. In an amusing experience of mine, I was once asked in Singapore by some Singaporean leaders, can Confucian ethics be taught in English? There are 2 or 3 scholars over there. All of them say no, cannot be taught in English because Confucianism is so much East Asian culture. It has to be taught in one of the East Asian languages. And you have to know characters. You know the characters of Ren as humanity, Yi as rightness, Yi as propriety, and so forth. Otherwise, you will not be able to appreciate the nuanced aspects of the Confucian. I was the only one who said no. I don't believe Confucianism has to be taught in Chinese or East Asian languages. It can very well be taught in English. I've been doing that for a long time. And it's not just apologetic or try to find some kind of justification. And I deliberately try to do this for the following reason. That if Confucian ethics cannot be taught in English, or for that matter in German, French, or other languages, begins intrinsically with certain kind of parochialism, certain kind of culturalism, certain kind of nationalism built into the structure. And it could turn out to be suffocating from a Confucian point of view. Because if you need to move beyond the self to the community, to the nation, and to the world, and yet the whole tradition is totally seasoned in a particular cultural form, and only meaningful to people of the same or some kind of ethnic, social, political background. It is something to do. Now, there's no question about the fact when a rich tradition is being taught in a foreign language, not the language of its own, a great deal is lost. It can never be retrieved. But don't forget, all kinds of new horizons being opened up, new possibilities being injected, new questions being raised. If the tradition cannot move beyond nationalism and culturalism, not that it will continue to be a very powerful force in East Asia, is going to fade away. A tradition that is dynamic will have to transform itself, meeting new challenges and environment. That's the reason why the three great world religions do not have specific cultural forms. You cannot say Christianity has a particular cultural form. American culture, British culture, French culture, Dutch culture. You have to say Thai culture, Korean culture, Chinese culture. They're all possible. You cannot say you have to know Hebrew before you can appreciate the Bible. You can do it in English, in Chinese, in Swahili. That's true with Buddhism. You cannot say that the Buddhist in Thailand is more authentic than the Buddhist in San Francisco or in Boston. Muslim, or the Islamic world, you cannot say that Muslims in the Middle East are more authentic than, say, Muslims in Asia. So these three religions are all world religions. But there are some traditions that are very much tied to a particular culture for both its strength and its limitation, such as Shintoism with Japanese culture. Difficult to imagine anyone who's not Japanese who becomes a Shinto, or who's a Shinto. Shinto is not a Japanese. It's very close to me. But Confucianism, to a certain extent, Hinduism and other traditions are in between. So now, for the Confucian tradition to become ecumenical, to be able to move beyond, conscientiously, you have to transcend its own limited structure. The critical issue is to underscore the spiritual dimension in the harmony with nature. Now, the ecological question helped the Confucian tradition to return to its own base in terms of the unity between human and heaven. Windsor Chen, in his celebrated source book in Chinese philosophy, opens his inquiry with the following statement. If one word could characterize the entire history of Chinese philosophy, that word would be humanism. Then, with an explanatory note, not the humanism that denies or slides a supreme power, but one that professes the unity of man or humanity and heaven. In this sense, humanism has dominated Chinese thought from the dawn of its history. So when he used the character humanism, he really had the Confucian tradition in mind. But the humanism that professes the unity of humanity and heaven is neither secular humanism nor anthropocentric. So while it fully acknowledges that we are embedded in earth, body, family, and community, it never denies that we are in tune with the cosmic order. So the question that we are embedded in earth, the body, the family, and community. And yet there is always a transcendent reference. It's a reference to something which is higher, which is greater, which is beyond. If we say we are embedded in earth, we're committed to the development of the earth without any sense of a transcendence, then it's a secular humanism, then it doesn't have an ecumenical worldview. In this sense, self-realization from a Confucian point of view depends on knowing and serving a higher order of meaning. which means heaven. Unless we have some sense of heaven as embodied in our body, in earth, in the community as a whole, the Confucian project is incomplete. So you have to have the spiritual dimension as an integral part of that process. That is the ultimate concern. So you have to go beyond secular humanism to realize the Confucian humanism. I believe that one interesting strength, depends upon how it's going to work out, it's almost like a futuristic outlook. One possible contribution of this mode of thinking is to the formulation or development of an idea which is very widely appreciated now, even in the modern West, the idea of the public intellectual. If the Confucian tradition, with the challenge of ecology, is going to be an important reference for us in the West, perhaps the idea of the public intellectual. What does it mean? My definition of a public intellectual is very simple. In other words, it's not an elitist idea. My definition will include everybody here, whether you like it or not. You're not just a potential public intellectual, you are public intellectual. A person who is politically concerned, not that you become politicians, but socially engaged. You're in the world, you have relationships, you do some kind of social service, you're socially engaged. And culturally sensitive or informed. We can say ecologically aware, maybe even religiously, musically, but these are possibilities. But a person who is politically concerned, socially engaged, and culturally sensitive, it is an attitude, it's a state of mind. It is, of course, it's not simply you imagine what that is, it's also praxis. Anyone who is in the process of being trained as a leader is a potential, it is basically a public intellectual. Normally, we consider the idea intellectual in the West as someone who has a critical spirit. Often it's against the establishment. They want to criticize the government, criticize the status quo. But this definition of the public intellectual, based upon our understanding of the Confucian tradition, is very different from the idea of the intellectual as a critic. If the intellectual is someone who is politically concerned, socially engaged, and culturally sensitive, then this group of people do not simply exist in the academic community. Academic community is only one of those arenas in which the public intellectuals eventually emerge. Many public intellectuals would actually serve in government, inside the establishment. But still, they are socially concerned, politically concerned, socially engaged, culturally sensitive. They can criticize the government from within. But the public intellectuals also are people working in the mass media, working in business. You may become a business executive, you may become a clerk, you may become a lawyer. Your role as a public intellectual is not at all linked to your profession. It has to go beyond the profession. Public intellectuals are also in various kinds of religious spheres, but also in social organizations and social movements. So it is not a profession. It is a vocation. It's simply an attitude, a concern. If we look at the idea of the Confucian, not a scholar of Confucius, but a concerned scholar, like idea of Confucian, it fits this notion about the public intellectual very well. It is in this sense that the word Confucian can become an adjective. They're Confucian Christians, or Confucian Buddhists, or Confucian Muslims. In interreligious dialogue, we can explore this a little bit more. But as an adjective, like Socrates, or Socratic, or Aristotelian, it is simply to know a particular concern, particular concern in society. And normally, you do not choose to become a Confucian in this sense. You become one. You choose to become a Buddhist. You choose to become a Christian. But normally, you do not choose to become a Confucian. Or the Hindus will tell you that you do not choose to become a Hindu. But this notion about the concerned scholar is different, but at the same time interacts very, very well with many other personality types. For example, the philosopher, the prophet, the guru, the monk, the priest. None of these ideas, the philosopher, for example, in the Greek sense, or the prophet in the Judaic sense, or the priest in the Christian sense, the monk in the Buddhist sense, or guru in the Hindu sense, each one of them is a source of inspiration for human flourishing. But each one of them has some kind of a tension, very powerful tension, with the idea of the public intellectual. The idea of the philosopher is in tension with the public intellectual because the idea of the philosopher is truly elitist. Only a very small minority of us will ever become philosophers from a Greek point of view. And the idea of prophet is someone who's heard the voice of God, but who will have to transmit that value through interpretation. We never heard it. We have to. So there's a gap between the sacred and the profane, between the multitude and the small group of chosen. The guru, the monk, and so forth, all have this notion about a spiritual domain totally outside of the world we are. But the idea of the public intellectual fits well with the Confucian conception of an engaged scholar. This is someone who's in the world, but not of the world. Is it possible to develop a certain kind of network, a network, horizontal network, in reference to the situation in China that broadly defined, of these public intellectuals concerned about these issues of the sanctity of the earth, the human community, and the global community, the importance of cultural diversity, and the idea of the sustainable growth, and develop a mission or sense of vocation independent of their professions, but drawing resources from their professions. So that is an issue for us to, at least for us to explore. Then if we revisit the idea in the Great Learning, instead of thinking about the Great Learning as a statement about learning to be human as a Confucian, but a statement about learning to be human as a public intellectual. It is not just a political statement. Self-cultivation, family regulation, governance of the state and universal peace is a vision about global governance, which is universalizable not only as a specific concern of a group of cultural elite, but as something that's relevant to us here and now. All international movements right now, whether you call them United Nations or various kinds of non-governmental organizations, are desperately in need of a new kind of networking, a new kind of vision, which goes beyond simply the ideas of nation states, idea of patriotism confined in terms of specific nations. Let me conclude with this simple thought. If the Confucian tradition is able to embrace this ecological vision, rather than simply an ideology for development, defined in terms of economic growth, it shows that an inseparable aspect of a sustainable human-earth relationship is, of course, the creation of harmonious societies and benevolent governments through self-cultivation of all members of the human community. In other words, what we do in the political arena, in the social arena, is not at all unrelated to the cosmic order or to the ecological issue. At the same time, Confucians insist that being attuned with the changing patterns in nature is essential for harmonizing human relationships, formulating family ethics, and establishing a responsible and responsive government. The whole idea of heaven, earth, and human rests on a kind of seamless yet dynamic interaction between each of these realms. Without harmony with nature and its myriad changes, human society and governance is threatened. Since each person's self-cultivation is essential for social political order, the public intellectual is not an elitist, but an active participant in the daily affairs of the life world. So the idea of the concerned scholar, which seems to be an appropriate model. So in order to foster a wholesome worldview and a healthy ecological ethic, we need to combine our aspiration for harmonious relationship with nature with our concerted effort to build a just society. And these are four basic beliefs, we can say almost like a new kind of faith community. That first of all, the transcendent reference is absolutely critical. Therefore, we have to regard heaven as a source of creativity and meaning. If the dimension of the transcendent of heaven is gone, then the Confucian tradition fails. So it's better for the Christians to have an idea of God, for the Muslims to have an idea of Allah, for the Hindus to have an idea of Brahman, for this public intellectual to function as a responsible member of the society. So it is the Confucian aspiration that transcendent dimension not be regulated with fact. So the Confucian will celebrate the Christian idea of God, the Muslim idea of Allah, because heaven as a source of creativity and meaning is absolutely critical for the Confucian idea of public intellectual. And the second commitment is the commitment to the sanctity of the earth by transforming the world here and now using the Buddhist idea into a pure legend. You may say, we wait for the kingdom of God to come. We wait for another world to come. We can produce this one. Then you abdicate your responsibility as a public intellectual. And the Confucian notion, in Zhangzai and in the Western inscription and others, regarding human beings as filial children of cosmos become very, very important for understanding the role of the public intellectual. Then we can say even some of the core values in the Confucian tradition, humanity, rightness, civility, wisdom, and trust. These are not core values for the maintenance of a human community per se. These are the core values that will help us to reestablish the human-earth relationship in a much grandiose vision. So then the worldview try to develop is not at all incompatible with the development of ethics. Indeed, the worldview becomes imperative. This new worldview becomes imperative as a basis for the development of a comprehensive ethics.